Just to build on what Patrick just said, we're in a world where the American sort of foundation of strength needs to be based on credible influence rather than hardware. Anybody who looks at the budget in Congress can see that our grand strategy, or our strategy for the world, is basically, I'm going to kill you. And that's not a persuasive argument anymore, for the most part, in today's world. We have to change that. So if we're living in a world where credibility and credible influence is more important, I think, than hardware at this point, that changes your whole set of tools. It makes things like expectations and a strategic asset to the extent that you can use hope to build towards this future. It makes things like hypocrisy a dagger to the heart of your strategy. That's where drone strikes just can't work in the long run. You can't go out on the one hand and give a big speech about rule of law, and then on the other hand, fire from the sky with impunity and think that A, anybody's going to believe anything you say, or B, that this isn't going to show up at Radio Shack in 20 years. The irony of what's going on in the world, where you had this sort of FBI best circle who was going to use handheld planes on the Capitol, or these guys in Georgia who want to dump a ricin bomb on Washington, D.C. at the same week that you're killing an American citizen in Yemen. I mean, there's a lot of really very satisfying parts to drone strikes. Killing bin Laden was very satisfying, I think, for the Americans, but the long-term implications of that for the country that claims credibility as the rule of law example setter, I think, is something, again, which requires some strategic knowledge. That's the kind of thing, to get to your question about worldview, that I don't think is going to happen in Washington, D.C. I think we can create whole parallel systems of information support with real-time technology right now that we've hardly begun to explore. There's a group of, for example, climate scientists doing a rapid response fact-checking for committee hearings right now, where they're on handheld, they're on mobile devices, because they're webcasting everything. People should pay really close attention to the transparency rules that are changing, especially on the House side. The House's IQ is a far bigger problem than the Senate's. And you can offside its IQ. And let me just bring up something else that's got a lot of theoretical attention in the last 20 years, is this notion of social capital. Social capital is basically value based on cooperation and relationships. In my experience, Susanna, who was our press secretary, we sat next to each other on the Hill for 8 years, is the people with the highest value social capital spend it terribly or don't spend it at all. And so unless we figure out ways to organize our relationships in a far more effective way, possibly in the district, not in DC, we're not going to be able to compete with the money.
In the district, you mean?
In districts and states, outside of Washington, D.C. And I think we can do that with technology again, and the fact that there's, even if you organize sort of surge teams of retired Foreign Service officers to be situational awareness teams in districts and states, they'd love to help in this way. And the other thing you do is, somebody mentioned trust and high reputation. Congress is a vortex of information with no search engine right now. And what you can do with reputation and trust is create filters. And again, I don't think it's going to happen nearly as effectively here, because you have places like the Stimson Center, which doesn't have huge conflicts of interest with money, but still is not getting its ideas across on Capitol Hill like we should. Is that you can create very high value, high reputation filters back in states and districts, and that's a way to spend those social relationships, social capital, how to spend that in a way that impacts politics, because they're very influential and they're very underused. Does that make sense what I'm saying right now? You can do this because there's no financial conflict of interest. But the kind of transparency requirements that are happening today, what's happening is our system's dumping even more information into a system that's kind of cynical and doesn't have a capacity to hold leadership accountable for the information that we have. So unless we can create those accountability mechanisms, all the transparency in the world is just going to make us more skeptical. So creating filters locally that are based on trust and reputation is huge. Let me give you an example of why that's so important right now. Since this new Congress came in, members are in their districts 10 to 12 weeks more per session than last year. What is interaction doing about this? the advocacy community, I think, has to update and modernize itself. They're using what I call surround and punish tactics. It's basically Napoleonic warfare tactics in the advocacy community, where if you're sitting on a Hill staff, sorry to keep picking on you, Susanna, but if somebody's yelling at you before, during, and after a vote, what you're going to do is run away from them as soon as you see them in the house, or run into the cafeteria, or not answer that phone call. It's just human nature to me, how the advocacy community, A, is so cranky all the time, and B, not useful in the political environment that you're working in, or C, comes with great shiny footnotes 6 weeks too late, or B, or 4, asked you to extract legislation out of a dissertation. I could go on. Or you're sitting, I mean, we were in Marin County. One person was chaining themselves to the power plant, and the other person was sending me a PhD dissertation from Stanford. And I was supposed to stop doing something because of what they were telling me and extract legislation about Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The whole operational piece is missing, in other words. That's what the knowledge brokering world is supposed to do a lot better. And we just haven't updated and modernized since the 80s, I would argue. So the advocacy community needs to really think hard about how to decentralize and become much stronger off-site. Otherwise, we're just not going to be able to compete with the money. And let me just also put a theory I have out there, is that there's this wonderful notion in economics called comparative advantage. And I'll just say what I think that means is that you specialize and you get what you want because of something that you specialize in. And the right specializes in money, and the left specializes in noise to get influence on Capitol Hill. And neither of those things are working. This is another great economics term. It's called diminishing returns. They've reached the point of saturation, so more noise isn't going to help that much, and more money isn't going to help that much. So your cartel is complete. We have to actually crack the information cartel, and I think you can do that with disruptive technology today. There aren't a lot of pilot projects going on out there, but frankly, interaction, talk about a high value, high social capital network that does not leverage its resources well in Congress. Sorry, but
you're not offending me.
Okay.
Because actually one of the things that I want us to get funding for are the systems to support how we bring in that outside.
Right, and I think that it's going to take different kinds of assessment tools, mapping tools.
Right, exactly, which is expensive. But
it's expensive, but the thing is that we're not having to recreate the wheel. We just need to get it rolling at this point in a different direction. So I don't know if I've answered this. The problem too with information and the lack of filters in the world we're living in is information can do one of two things. It can open minds or confirm prejudices. Right now, the people who use it to confirm prejudices have a home field advantage. It's the religious right. It's very narrow. It's the us versus them world when we're all us at this point, right? If that's not obvious. The way I like to think about it is simple. And I became a national security wonk by accident because I lived in Berlin in 1989 and I saw that the world had basically ended. The thing that killed me was this policy we lived under called mutual assured destruction, which was a mutual suicide pact. So just think about it this way. For the last 100 years, we've been exquisitely planning how we're all going to die together. For the next 100 years, we need to be exquisitely planning how we're all going to live together. That is the problem set. And we can do that. I mean, Americans are good at participation. We're good at this. We don't see it as a strategic advantage yet. The self-determination is now intrinsic to any nation's vision of security and stability. And how do we help give that to them? The best thing we can do for the world is improve our own practice of democracy.